Please help me welcome our speaker. The great Jess Almlie is returning to our virtual stage. Jess is the owner and learning and performance strategist at Almlie Consulting. She has such a clear and razor sharp perspective, and we are so delighted to have her back with us. So, Jess, the session is all yours.
Fantastic. Thanks. Well, let me go ahead and share my screen. So hello, everybody. My name is Jess Almlie, and I am on a mission to shift this profession that we know and love so much as learning and talent development from this place where we work in a very transactional way inside an invisible yet very real box, transactional box of order taking, to one where we can work more as strategic business partners for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, because that allows us to reach our full potential in the work that we do. And secondly, if we don't do that, our organizations are missing out. To be honest, we are the team that can help to solve the talent challenges. We can drive the performance of the company forward by equipping, enabling, and developing the people within it. And I believe we can do all that. I've seen the shift happen, but we've got to get rid of this invisible box. And there is a way to do that. So today, we're going to focus on one very specific way to begin stepping outside of that trap, outside of that box. And that is with how we very intentionally say yes and say no when we're asked for training or learning solutions. So if that sounds good to you and you're ready to go with that, if you would leave and do an emoji in the chat so we can get going with that. Some kind of chat emoji, if you would. So that tells me we're ready to go. You choose the emoji. Oh, I'm not in presentation mode.
Not quite. We can see the slides on the side.
Okay, hold on. I have share.
Yeah,
So
it's
let's do it
sharing
again.
the actual
No, I chose,
PowerPoint.
it's very odd because I chose slideshow presentation mode, but it didn't go into it.
Sometimes it's hard-headed.
Okay, everyone, hang with us. This is a learning and talent development crowd, so we've all been there. So I'm going to just close out of my PowerPoint presentation and reopen it real quickly and see if that resets it. Sometimes that can do the trick because it was showing as presentation mode on my screen. All right, now I think we've got it. Okay, let me go to share here. Let's start over. Here we go. All right. Are we seeing the right thing, Casey?
Beautiful.
Alrighty, yay. And thanks everyone for putting those emojis in the chat while we were getting our technical pieces put together. So here we go. So I'm really lucky in that I had one of my very first jobs. I had a role where taking orders was literally in the job description. And here that role is. Maybe you saw a sneak of it if you already saw the side panel of the slides, but this is me circa 1990-ish when I was working at McDonald's and I was taking orders in northern Minnesota. I was like a drive-through queen, if you will. Is there anybody here who worked in a similar job? If you did, put where you worked in the chat. What kind of place did you work where you literally your job was to take and deliver on orders? Haha, Heather, we are both McDonald's gals. An order writer, like it. The uniform. Yeah, I don't know why we thought we needed to have bow ties and flair and a stripy button-up shirt, but that was how the early 90s McDonald's was. Much more casual now, by the way. BK, Del Taco, local custard burger joint, preschool teacher, not the same. Andrea, yes, I imagine that is a whole different way of working as an order taker. So a lot of us have worked in this type of a career or a job. And if we haven't, I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm fairly confident in saying that we have been the person who has placed the order and been the recipient, therefore, on the other end. So we're all pretty familiar with this, what this order taking looks like. Now, despite the layer of grease that covered my face when I'd come home after my shift at McDonald's, I really liked the job. I was busy the whole time, so the time went fast. I knew how to be successful. Somebody asked me for something. I knew how to fulfill that in the way that gave them exactly what they asked for. And I remember one day I was standing near the back of the store and the regional manager was making his rounds and he stopped to chat with me. And he said to me, Jess, I just know it. You're going to be a McDonald's lifer. And I kind of paused for a moment because I did one of those things where the gears in your brain kind of stop. And I had to get my wits together. And eventually I said, in what seemed like a long time, but it probably wasn't, I said, thank you, because I knew he meant it as a compliment. But inside, I was thinking, no, 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 no. I have no intention of working in this type of order taking capacity for the rest of my life. Well, fast forward, after college, this was a college job, I started working in learning and talent development almost immediately. I was an orientation coordinator, and then I moved up throughout my career, my 30-plus-year career now in learning and talent development. And I did a lot of different things. I like to say I've had all the jobs. Earlier in my career, I worked really hard to be an L&D or learning and talent development rock star, as I'm sure all of you are doing the same, or you wouldn't be investing in yourself in this type of a webinar experience like we are today. But to me, earlier in my career, what this meant was creating the most engaging and interactive learning experiences possible using all the best practices. And for the most part, those that engaged in the experiences that I created and that I delivered earlier in my career, I believe they enjoyed it. They were taking home nuggets. All of that was happening. And then I started to lead learning and talent development teams, and I led them to do the same. We were creating fantastic learning and talent development experiences. And I remember the day when all of this switched. I was sitting across from a particular stakeholder, and she looked me straight in the eye and she said, Jess, your team's training wasn't good enough. And after I got over that feeling of the knife to the gut a little bit, I thought, no, you're wrong. Because I know that this training is good enough. I've seen it. I know that my team does top-notch work. The problem was that this training would have never solved the problem that she wanted it to solve in the first place. But yet, because the thought was that the training or learning solution would be the answer, and then when we delivered what she asked for and it wasn't the answer, the finger of blame pointed right back at us. It must have been that the training wasn't good enough. There couldn't possibly be anything else that could have solved this problem. So at that moment, I knew we needed to start working differently. But I didn't really know what that looked like at the time because there wasn't a lot out in the learning and talent development space to tell me how to work differently or what that meant. And so I started studying parallel professions like performance consulting, project management, sales and marketing, business overall. And I took little pieces of that and began infusing it into our work so that we slowly shifted until the point where one day I realized the business had stopped asking us for training and they had started coming to us to engage in collaborative conversations to solve talent challenges. And that, my friends, that is a very different conversation. No longer were we getting we need a 30-minute e-learning on this. We were getting we've got an issue. We're wondering if you can work with us to solve it. And sometimes the answer was training and sometimes it wasn't. But at that point, I knew that we had become what I now call strategic business partners. And at that point, I stepped back and I said, hold on, why doesn't everybody work this way? Because we were in lockstep with the business. We were working on the biggest talent challenges. We were moving strategic initiatives forward through people, and we had the metrics to show it. And I wondered what was happening and why we didn't, as a profession overall, all work as strategic business partners on a regular basis. So I did more research. I started asking questions. I interviewed dozens and dozens of learning leaders. And I said, if you are able to work in this way, what do you do differently? I mean, surely we can't be the only ones. And if you're not, then what's holding you back? And now I'm able to share the message of what we learned along the way and everything that I found out through that research to begin to move our profession forward as a whole by thinking about and approaching our work in different ways. So one of the very first questions that I would ask as I interviewed these different learning leaders was essentially, if we're not able to work this way, what's holding us back? And almost always the very first things that came forward, the first things that people said had to do with this. Well, we don't have the leadership support. We don't have clear organizational goals. We don't even know what we could align to right now because we don't get that information or it isn't clear in our organization. We don't have the maturity in our organization to begin even thinking in a different way, or we don't have the resources. Our team keeps shifting. And I don't want to discount that these are not blockers because they are. These exist in organizations. However, if we're going to start making this shift from a place where we're working as order takers to one where we're working more intentionally as strategic business partners, we don't start here. We're not going to start by trying to shift massive organizational things in the organization that maybe are holding us back or that we perceive. The best place for us to start is actually to turn the mirror around, because there are messages that we are sending in learning and talent development, messages that are actually reinforcing the fact that the way that you work with us, or reinforcing the message, the way that you work with us is to come to us with an order and we fulfill it. And so when I started to think about this, I realized that we are, in many ways, in learning and talent development, we are masters in the art of self-sabotage. In fact, masters in the art of unintentional self-sabotage. Because the very things that we think are helpful in the organization often are the things that are keeping us in that order-taking box. So one of the things that we need to do in order to begin to shift, to be more strategic, more intentional, is turn the mirror around and ask ourselves, what message are we unintentionally sending? And yeah, this is you repping your team, the learning and development shirt here standing in the mirror. Because often, again, what we think is helpful is unintentionally keeping us in that order-taking box. So today, we're going to dive into one very specific way we send a clear message that the way you work with us is in this order-taking transactional capacity. And that is how we respond to requests for training. Specifically, when we say one of two very simple answers. And those answers are when we say either yes or we say no. Two simple words, but yet they have huge implications. The one that is much more problematic and is the easier one to say. The one that is much more problematic is this three-letter word yes. Because in general, as a profession, we tend to lean towards yes. We want to be helpful. We want the business to see value in our work. It's easier to say yes than it is to say no and push back. We don't want to be seen as, quote, the department of no. We're afraid that it will make us irrelevant if we start to say no, that people won't come to us anymore. And therefore, eventually, we will no longer be needed and lose our jobs. Like this whole thinking goes through our heads in some way or another, whether or not it's intentional in front of mind or it's behind the scenes. And this is what gets us into trouble. Because every time we say yes to something that we shouldn't say yes to, for one of many reasons that we'll go through here in the rest of our time together, is that we reinforce that the way you work with us is to come to us with a request, we say yes, and then we move forward. Let me show you what I mean about how this can get to be problematic, or maybe one of the first signs, I should say. So has this ever happened to you? You say, somebody comes with a request, you say, yeah, I can do that. And then later you have this moment where you think, why did I just say yes to that? But now you're committed. I call this the regretful yes. So it sounded like a good idea in the moment. And then later on, for whatever reason, it doesn't. But you've already committed. So now you need to follow through. So let me ask you if you would share in the chat real quickly, because maybe this is you. What are some reasons we might end up regretting the fact that we said yes later? What are some of the reasons you can think of that we might regret our yes? Time restraints. The to-do list is so long. The scope creep, we can't prioritize it. The capacity. Training isn't the answer. We realize that too late. We can't compete with the yes within budget. We don't have enough information. We can't follow up on it. It's not actually a training need. There's some other issue. The content was final, but it wasn't. The writer wasn't a SME. When we underestimate the demands on our time, all of these things later, we end up with this pit in our stomach and we think, oh no, here I am now stuck in kind of this order taking box again. Now, the reasons that some of the reasons why this regretful yes makes an appearance, you've shared a bunch of these. These are the ones that always come to mind with me. And many of you said some of these. Number one, there's a no inside of every yes. So every time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else, whether or not that's intentional, because there's only limited time within our worlds. And so if we say yes to something, and then later on, something that's maybe more important comes along, we have already said no to that. We've said no to some of the more strategic work because we've been reactionary and said yes to some of that work. So there's a no inside of every yes. We need to understand what that no is in order to be intentional. Secondly, learning can't solve every problem, as many of you pointed out, as was the case with me when that stakeholder looked at me and said this training wasn't good enough. It was actually an issue of training not being able to solve that problem. And as a wise mentor once said to me, there will always be more requests than there are resources. There will always be more requests than there are resources. And so that means we need to get away from this regretful yes so that we can adequately prioritize, so that we're saying yes to the right things. And luckily, I believe there is an antidote to this regretful yes. And the antidote is this: strategic intention. So we respond in a way that is more than a simple yes or no. It's a response that's created through strategic intention. And usually this means we don't respond immediately, but we respond intentionally in a way that is strategic in nature, tied to the bigger picture, tied to the goals, helping move the organization forward for either our department, other departments, or the organization overall. And so now our challenge is to ensure that we answer with strategic intention, with the antidote to this regretful yes. And that to me is in one of two ways. We either answer with what I call is a strategic yes, which means yes, strategically and intentionally, this is a good choice, or a strategic no, which means I have intentionally decided that this is not the thing that I need to say yes to at this time. Either way, no matter if it's a yes or a no, it's intentional and it's strategic. And this starts from the intake process, which starts with designing an intake process itself that is strategic and intentional to the degree that it can be. So another question for you, you can answer in the chat, or actually this one's a poll. Casey, this is where our poll is coming up. The question is this: if we're working towards a response that is strategic and intentional, so strategic intention with a strategic yes or no, what's the initial goal of your intake process? If you think about you're working towards a strategic intention, yes or no, what's the initial goal of the intake process? And we've got a couple of options here. Is it to identify learning outcomes? You can choose as many, I believe, as many as you like. Is it to identify success measures? Is it to identify the SMEs and the stakeholders? Or is it to determine whether it's worth our time to dive deeper into this request? So what's the initial goal of our intake process? Identify learning outcomes, identify success measures, identify SME and stakeholders, or determine whether it's worth our time to dive deeper into this request. Casey, I'll leave it up to you as to when it looks like most people have voted and we're ready to reveal the results.
Okay, I think we're about there. We got about 70% participation.
Perfect. All right. So we've got some identify learning outcomes, success measures, SMEs, and stakeholders, but the winner overall is determine whether it's worth the time to dive deeper in this request. And ding, 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 yes, that is our initial goal for an intake process, to determine whether it's worth our time. Because if we're going to respond intentionally and not simply say yes or no, we need to ensure that our response is intentional and strategic. If we right away in our intake process, the first things we ask about our learning outcomes, success measures, SMEs, and stakeholders, essentially what we have done is started by sending the message that we are going to create training. So we've started by saying, we're going to create a training for you. And here's some of the things we need to do in order to create that training. So in an initial beginning of an intake process, we need to get the minimum amount of information needed to determine whether or not we dive deeper so that we can get to a place where we're giving a strategic yes or a strategic no. But we also need to assume right off the bat that we don't know the problem or the solution yet. And this is what then my team, when we did intake, we began to start with this assumption. Oftentimes we're told not to start with an assumption, but this is the assumption that works, which is we're going to assume that we don't know the problem or the solution yet. All we know at this point is that someone thinks training will help them. So an intake form at the onset doesn't need to be super in depth. It doesn't need to take a lot of time and effort. It just needs to, for us or for the stakeholder, it needs to ask the types of questions that get us to know whether we should dive in or we should move on. So it needs to help us get to this place where we can give a strategic yes or no. So I think about this strategic yes or no in two levels of intake. So the two different levels of intake is level one, we're asking, is it worth our time to dive deeper? That's the initial goal. And level two, we're actually getting to the place where we say yes or no strategically. And the reason I've broken it into two different levels is because there is a way that we can ask questions of ourselves that through this intake process that helps us to get to this yes or no. And that is two separate decision trees. So one decision tree, and that's what I'll share with you for the remainder of our time today. One decision tree is a tool that helps us determine whether or not it's worth our time to dive deeper. And then if we determine that it is, there's a second decision tree that will help us get to the yes or the no. So here we go. So let's dive into these decision trees. Actually, give me a little bit of a emoji if you're ready to see the different decision trees and start walking through them and get a new tool for some questions that you might ask in your intake process. I got smileys and thumbs up and trees. I like the tree emoji. One of the fun things is to see what emojis we all choose when we do this particular activity. So thanks for participating. All right. So number one, the very first decision tree starts with this question. Is it worth our time to dive deeper? So this is what we're trying to determine from this particular decision tree. And here's how we're going to do this, by the way. I'm going to walk through the decision tree question by question. And then at the end, I'll pause. So if you're somebody that wants to take a screen grab at that moment, I'll let you know when we're at the moment to take the best screen grab. I promise you that. And we'll stop and pause for questions at that point as well. I know Casey is also going to send out this deck as well as a PDF that has both of these decision trees on it. So you can get it at that point as well. So is it worth our time to dive deeper? This is the first thing we're going to start asking in our decision tree. And the first question is the easiest. The first question is this: does something already exist? Does something already exist that whatever this person is asking for, it's already out there? And so when we get this question, this is the easiest question. And if the answer is yes, then we can right off the bat share our very first strategic no. It's the easiest one to share because it means that there's something else already out there. Now, if there is something else already out there, please do not be crabby with your stakeholder who doesn't realize that something is out there. I know on our team, we used to get so frustrated. This is in the LMS. Why don't they know that? The thing is, our stakeholders typically aren't spending as much time in the LMS or with the content as we are. And so if there's something in there, consider it an opportunity to let them know that, hey, remember, this is a place you can look. And here it is. Look, there's something you're looking for already exists. This is the easiest one by far. Now, each time we talk about sharing a strategic no, I also want to pause and discuss what that no might look like and how it might sound when you work with your stakeholders. Because it is one of the things that, as I work with learning and talent development teams, comes up the most frequently, is something that they struggle with the most, is how do we say no? And in my experience, I'm going to tell you that I rarely said no that directly. It is, instead of just a direct no, it is a strategic no, which means it is also a considerate no. So the strategic no can also be a considerate no, which is when we can focus on, here's what we can do. In this instance, it's easy because we're saying what we can do is provide you with something that already exists. And look at, here it is. But the considerate no is kind, it's understanding, it's empathetic. And it keeps in mind the reason why our stakeholders has come to us looking for a solution in the first place. So let me ask you that. What is the real reason someone would come to us requesting training? What's the real reason they would come to us? Put your answer in chat if you have access to the chat. What's the real reason somebody comes to us or a stakeholder comes to us requesting training? Fill a gap, a performance issue, a problem, gaps. We're the trainers. They want to see behavior change. They're experiencing a problem. They know you. Sure, that might be. They want someone other than themselves. That can happen too. Refreshers. It's easier. Compliance is definitely a reason. So in overall, one of the reasons, kind of the psychology behind a request, a lot of these are true, but essentially, most often, there is some type of pain point. Something has happened or is happening in their world or on their team or in their area that isn't working. And they think in their minds that training will solve that problem, or they don't have time to address it or whatever it is, but there's something going on. And so the reason people come to us is because they have a pain point. Now, most stakeholders, if we gave them the choice and we said, you can have a training or we can solve the problem, which would you rather have? And if training isn't going to solve the problem, they would much rather have the problem solved than the training that they think they need. And so we begin to see the request first, frame it as essentially a cry for help. It's not necessarily a training need yet. We need to assume that that may or may not be the case. We don't know the problem or the solution. We're going to find it out. So we need to think about that. This is the reason people are coming to us is because there is some problem. And thus, part of our role is to help them figure out what that problem is and where they might head to find the solution. So let's go back to our first and easiest strategic no, but keeping in mind that the real reason behind most requests is some type of a pain point, because we'll revisit that again later. So our very first strategic no was there's another solution that already exists. The response to this is pretty easy. As I said, we kindly point them to the alternate resource. So this is the easy one in our full decision tree that we're going to work through. All right. So let's move on. Something already exists. If it does, we can share a strategic no right away. If it doesn't, we need to ask another question. And this is the second question that I recommend asking. Does this tie to some type of a strategic initiative in the organization? Now, this is a question that you can include on your intake form if it makes sense for your organization. What strategic initiative does this request tie back to? There was one gentleman that I talked to when I was doing all of the interviews, and they didn't necessarily ask the strategic initiative question, but they knew that every strategic initiative in the organization had to have an executive sponsor. So instead of saying, what strategic initiative does this tie to, they just started asking on the form, who is the executive sponsor for this request? And if that person didn't have an executive sponsor, it was pretty obvious that it wasn't going to tie to any type of strategic solution. What he said happened once they started to ask that question. In his words, all of the pet projects magically went away. So they stopped getting asked for small things and started to kind of start to train the business that we're responding to strategic initiatives or strategic requests first and foremost. So if it does tie to a strategic initiative, now this is a sign that we're going to want to pursue a deeper dive, because we still don't quite know the answers to all the questions we need to know yet, but we can jump into pursuing that deeper dive, which is the level 2 decision tree. We're going to hold off on that for a little bit because we will get there. But let's say that the answer here is no, it doesn't tie to a strategic initiative. That doesn't mean that we give up on it right away. There's another question that we need to ask, and a couple of you brought this up even in your comments. Is it based on a critical business or compliance need? Now, the reason why I think this question is important is for a couple of reasons. Number one, critical things do pop up in businesses that we haven't planned for strategically. The biggest one in the last, what now, 5, 6 years was COVID. That popped up, and all of a sudden we had to pivot in a whole different way. But it could be that something critical is happening in the business, like all of a sudden the customer service scores are failing. Why would that be? What we need to figure out that's going to impact the business in a critical level because we're going to lose customers. Or maybe there's a safety issue, depending on where you're working, that has now become critical to the business succeeding. So is it based on a critical business need that has now popped up that we maybe didn't know about earlier? Or is it based on a compliance need? Now, compliance isn't the most fun for those of us in learning and talent development. And many of us get frustrated with the compliance requests because they end up being requests to check boxes. And that can be true. However, the compliance issues are usually driven by, I would say, entities that are larger than us. And so with not responding to a compliance need could mean that we're going to get fined as an organization, or that we're not, that legally there's going to be legal implications. So we do need to consider whether or not it's a critical business or compliance need. So yes or no. If this is a critical business and compliance need, even if it's not tied to a strategic initiative, this is a good sign that now we should pursue a deeper dive. We also still need to dive in a little bit deeper here. But if it isn't, so it's not tied to a strategic initiative and it's not based on a critical business need, and we're coming up with no again in our decision tree, there are still some other questions that we need to consider. And I'm going to give you these 4 questions all at once because I advise that we consider them somewhat as a whole. They aren't as black and white, yes or no. They have a little bit more of an art to a science than to them. And those 4 questions are these. Do we need to build trust or influence with this particular stakeholder who's requesting or team? Will we gain needed visibility for learning and talent development? If you are working towards becoming a strategic business partner, trust and influence is important, as is a needed visibility to a certain degree to show about some of the work that you can do. So that may become important enough that it warrants a deeper dive, even if it's not tied to a strategic initiative or based on a critical or compliance need. However, maybe it's not for you right now, and you need to decide to what degree that is important. The other 2 questions, which are, will this provide a solution that scales? Those who are able to work more often as strategic business partners aren't necessarily fans of the one and done. So we're not going to create one thing and leave it and then put it on a shelf and it's not touched again it's not touched again across our organizations. We want to much more make a bigger impact. So if it's something that if we take it on, it will eventually scale in the future and benefit more of our business, that may be a reason to pursue a deeper dive. And then the final question is, will saying yes avoid future problems? And this is one where you need to determine if the future problem that it could cause is worthy of a deeper dive or it not. So these are the ones that there's a little bit more of an art than a science to it. They're not quite as black and white. So for example, saying yes may avoid some stakeholder being crabby with you. Does that matter? And to what degree? If it's the CEO, that may be a little bit different than if it's a contact center supervisor, for example. So there's a lot of things that may go into this to determine whether or not it's still worth a deeper dive. That's why I ask that you consider these questions as a whole. As we look at these questions, then there are 2 different ways we can go. We can either determine that this isn't tied to a strategic initiative, it's not based on a critical compliance need, and essentially these 4 questions at the bottom, we can basically say no to those, or to the degree that the impact they would have, it's not as important. So we can say no and share a strategic no at this point. If some of these warrant a deeper dive, then we can move to our deeper dive. So let's shift just for a moment. I want to talk about the strategic no in this instance, and then we'll pull back this full decision tree again, and you can take a screen grab on it. So here we go. If we are looking at all of these questions that we just talked about. It doesn't tie to a strategic initiative. It's not based on a critical compliance need. And then we sort of come up with no to those bottom questions. And we're going to share a strategic no. Basically, what we're saying is that this doesn't make our priority list. Now, this is a tricky one to say no to because nobody wants to hear you're not a priority to us, especially when they took the time to come to us with a request. So how do you say no when the reason is it doesn't make your priority list? So here's what I have used in the past, a couple of things that have worked. And also when I talked with others, they have used some of these as well. My two kind of top go-tos in this point are the let's circle back or let's reverse the SME. So let me explain what I mean by that. Circle back may mean, right now our team is focusing primarily our time primarily on strategic initiatives or critical business or compliance needs. And so right now, this particular issue, this particular request can't make it into our priority list, but let's circle back. We can, if you would circle back with me in 4 months, 6 months, whatever you decide it is, then we can chat about it again. Now, I generally ask them to circle back because oftentimes or sometimes the issue that they're having may go away on its own, and then we don't need to have that conversation again. So circle back with me in 6 months, 4 months. This is still an issue, and let's have this conversation again. The other one that I've used before is what I call the reverse SME. So those who are working in as more often as strategic business partners, one of the trends that I identified through the research was that they were okay not owning all of the learning and talent development that happened in the company. They know that in the organization, development, coaching conversations, other learning is going to happen on a daily basis that they don't own or control. And so then if it's something that doesn't make the priority list, we still want to be helpful. We can offer to serve as the SME for that area as they create their own training or learning experience. And so what I would often say is this, that basically the thing where we are focused on strategic initiatives and critical and compliance needs right now. But what we could do is if you still want to create that training, we can give you some tips as to what it means to create a fantastic training or learning experience. And then we'll serve as the subject matter experts for you. So you create something, bring it to us, and we'll give you some tips and tricks as to how to improve it along the way. That can work in some instances. So that's another way to say, hey, here's what we can do, and giving a strategic and considerate no. So here we have now completed going through this first level decision tree. You may want to, in your organization, add some additional questions or other questions depending on what works in your organization. This is really more of an art than a science in some ways. The most important thing and the reason why I like to use a decision tree is that it helps to ensure that my answer is intentional and that I've thought through it. So I'm curious for you at this point, either if you would be willing to share some of your thoughts on this decision tree and or maybe how you might modify it in your own organization if you're already thinking of that or use it. Or Casey, this is a great time for us to pause, and I am happy to answer some questions that have come up for you until this point.
No questions yet in the Q&A bubble, but we've still got time.
Yeah, we do. So Megan's saying this is very helpful. A reverse me, but you do use it semi-regularly. I'm glad, Matthew. I'm curious if you're willing to put in the chat again, how often is it, how often do people take you up on it? Because I found it goes kind of either way. Some people are happy to do that, but others, to them, it's not worth it. They don't want to spend the time to do the training. And so then it sort of goes away because we're not willing to put in the time. So that can happen as well. The 1-minute manager aligns how you're moving forward with the restructured team. You call it consulting. Very good. Very good. All right. Let's move into then the next level. And again, if you think of questions along the way, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. I will pause again after we get this full second decision tree up so that you can use that as well. All right. So the second decision tree generally starts with we're aiming to answer the question. We're aiming to essentially get to our strategic yes or no very intentionally. And this second decision tree is really the overview to the first, because the first question we ask is it worth the time to dive deeper? And the way we determine whether or not it's worth the time to dive deeper is through that first decision tree. So essentially, this one is like the big map, and then the is it worth the time to dive deeper is like the little inlet of the city, so we can zoom in. So is it worth the time to dive deeper? Yes or no? If no, as we said earlier, we're going to share a strategic no. But if yes, we're going to start to ask some additional questions. So here's the first additional question now that I like to ask. And I know you all know this one is coming. And that is, can training or learning solve the problem? So first of all, we've determined maybe this is a strategic initiative, or it's not, or it's a critical or compliance need, or it may be something that could scale, but can training or learning solve the problem? This is where it's really helpful to have some information about the different influencers within an organization that can influence performance, so that we know whether or not it is a gap that training can solve. And that can be found in the study of performance consulting. Looking at, my favorite is Gilbert's behavioral engineering model. That's one that I use on a regular basis. But basically, there's only one thing that learning or training can solve for, and that is a lack of skills and knowledge. So we can't out-train the clunky system, the clunky workflow. We can't out-train the manager that refuses to give feedback. We can train a manager who doesn't know how to give feedback. But if that manager is refusing to give feedback, a training or learning will not solve that problem. We can't out-train misaligned rewards. We can't out-train unclear expectations. We can't out-train somebody's not having access to the right information. These are all other things that can kind of seem like they could be a training issue, but they aren't. I'll give you one quick example. So in the organization that I worked for previously, there was a team that completed two different types of tasks. They had simple tasks and they had more complex tasks in their queue. They were claims processors. Simple claims, complex claims. The manager of this team came to us and said, hey, we need you to train on these complex claims because nobody's doing them. So nobody's taking them out of the queue. They don't know how to do them. They even used our language, like they don't know how. Well, we dove in a little deeper. It was worth our time to dive deeper at that point and asked a few more questions. And something really interesting happened. What I found out was that after talking with some of these different people on the team, this team was rewarded. They got a bonus based on the number of tasks they completed and how accurate they were. So the number and accuracy. If they took on the complex claims, the complex tasks in the queue, it was going to take them longer, so they wouldn't get as many done. And they were more likely to make an error because they were more complicated. So literally, the problem was not that these people didn't know how to process the complex claims. It was that if they took them on, they would literally make less money. Creating a training for that would have never helped in the long run. It would have just led us to the same problem once again. So can training or learning solve the problem? Yes or no? If no, we're going to share that strategic no. And this one also can be a good one that we can say in a different way that is helpful. So here's how I generally approach it. If I found out that there's something else other than training that is behind the issue, I'll usually kind of start like this, like, you know, what's really interesting I just found out, or what I heard, or, you know, we can't create a really great training until XYZ happens, kind of a thing. So first of all, I'll say, you know, what's really interesting is that I learned from these claims agents that they actually make less money when they take on the complex claims. Would you be willing to try fixing that, adjusting that compensation first? And then if there's still an issue, come back and we'll talk about training again. And that's how I responded to that. And guess what? They never came back. Another situation I ran into was very much misaligned expectations, where there were two managers for a team who believed that the work needed to be done in two very different ways. And they brought me in because they needed a communication boot camp. So communication boot camp we need because people don't know how to communicate well in our team. Um, and as I dove in more and even just asked questions, I didn't even have to get to the point where I was interviewing or asking different people in the team how they were doing their job, or even a full-on needs assessment to that degree. It became very obvious that these two managers disagreed. And so my response was, you know what? I'd love to create this training for you, but it's really difficult to create the training when we're not aligned on what the outcome should be or what good looks like. If you all can align on the expectations for the team in terms of how they do the work, then let's, if that doesn't fix the issue, let's come back. I'll come back and let's talk about training again. So sort of a like, I'm still on your side. I really want you to solve this problem, but here's what I see. Try this first. And if we still need it, I'm willing to come back. So that's the second question on this second level decision tree. Can training or learning solve the problem? If not, then let's share a strategic no. If yes, there are still a couple other questions that I believe we need to consider in order to be giving our best strategic yes. And that is this. The first one is this. Does the learning and talent development team have the needed capacity and expertise to deliver on this training? So now we've determined that it is a training or learning can solve the problem, and it was worth our deeper dive. So it was strategic, or it was all of the things on the first level. And now we need to know, but can we do it? Do we have the capacity within our team right now? Do we have the expertise? So if the answer is no, we're going to go to a strategic no in this instance. And here's what that could potentially look like. If we don't have the capacity, if we don't have the expertise, the first thing we can offer is, hey, we don't have the expertise on our team right now or the capacity, but we can help you find someone who can. Now, of course, this means they're going to probably need to pay for that. We can help them find a consultant, a trainer, somebody else who can come in and help them with this particular issue if we don't have the capacity, we don't have the expertise. We can also ask for them to help to wait. We're willing to, if it's something where we're willing to up level ourselves and gain the expertise, but that may take a little bit longer. We may even ask them to help fund that. Hey, if you'd like our team to do this, we're happy to do that, but we've got to get some additional training ourselves. Would you be willing to help fund that for us? If it's a capacity issue, this is very similar to it can't be a priority right now. And so we can use the let's circle back or let's reverse the SME, that type of response. All right. Still, one more question to go. So does the learning and talent development team have the needed capacity and expertise? If no, we're going to share a strategic no. If yes, we need to ask very specifically about the stakeholder partnering to support the solution. So will the stakeholder partner with us to support the solution? And when we ask about this and get to this level, we need to be very specific with our ask in terms of what support and partnership looks like. So a couple of examples. Do we need funds in order to create this? Do we need time and effort from a subject matter expert on their team so that we can partner? Do we need to sit with their team in shadow so we can really understand what the needs are? My other one is, do we need them to become a champion of this solution and ensure that they're communicating it to those who need to participate? One of the things I had learned the hard way over time was I had a group come and we really need this training. We created the training, and then later on, they never told anybody about it. So nobody ever knew that this training existed. Therefore, it was never taken advantage of on their team. And therefore, it was a waste of our time and effort to create it. So very specific about what we need for that stakeholder in order to support the solution. If that stakeholder is unwilling to support and partner with us on the solution, then we need to share a strategic no. Another instance where we say no. And a no in this instance, I find can look something like this. We're not going to be successful without your commitment to whatever it is. If nobody knows about this training after we complete it, then nobody's going to take it. And it's basically not worth our time and effort to work on it. For example, we need you to commit to a plan in order to spread the word once we're completed. Can you commit to that? We won't be successful without a SME who can dedicate time to help us create this. So if they're unable to commit that, we're going to ask, when might you be able to commit that? Or is it possible that you'd be able to commit to that at a different point in time? Or do you have another solution as to how we might gain the commitment we need in order to move forward? So that's our last one. So we have will the stakeholder commit partner to support the solution? If no, we're sharing a strategic no. If yes, we have finally arrived. We have arrived at our strategic yes, and we can say yes, knowing that we are doing so in a way that is intentional, both strategic and intentional, that we're saying yes to the right things so that in our time, in the work that we do, in our limited time and resources, we're saying yes to the things where we are going to have the biggest impact. So I am curious now. This is the second decision tree. So feel free to take a screen grab at this point if you're a screen grab person. And at that moment, then, Casey, have we had any questions come in the Q&A? And if we haven't at this point, feel free to put a question in the chat as well. Or I see Joanne saying being a strategic partner is all about this, creating work streams to structure and organize. Great. If you've got comments, ideas, thoughts, put those in the chat as well, because sometimes one of the best things we can do is learn from the comments and ideas that others share in the webinars as well. So Casey, with that, have any questions come in?
Yes, we asked, someone is asking for you to clarify or recap the idea of the reverse me.
Yeah, for sure. So the reverse me is when we act as the me in learning. So we come in with our learning expertise and we help somebody else to create the training. So we're essentially, maybe we're doing like a train the trainer, or we're doing a here's the best practices if you're going to create this training yourself, but we're not creating the training ourselves. We're allowing that stakeholder that's asking for the training or learning to create it for their own team. And then we act as the learning SMEs to help them to make sure that it's going to be as impactful as possible, that they're following some of our best practices about how adults learn and whatnot. So that's what the reverse SME is.
Perfect. And Terry asked another good question. How do you, as the developer, handle a request when all of the questions are decided prior to you getting involved with the request?
Yep. Well, so that is, of course, an issue where you can only start from where you're at. So all of these questions, all of this has already been decided. And I've been in this situation before. First off, one of the best things that you can do is up-level your business acumen in the organization so that you can talk the talk that the rest of the organization is talking, and you can ask really intelligent questions in that way that have to do with with the with the strategic initiatives, that kind of thing. You can ask about these questions. Sometimes we don't move the needle by taking an action, but we plant a seed by asking a question that therefore maybe somebody will then think about next time. That's one of the best ways to have influence, especially when you're at a lower level and you're not making the decisions. But you can ask the question when it's already been decided, does this tie to one of our strategic initiatives in the organization? I'd like to make sure that I know that so that I can make sure that we're aligning and we're having I'm aligning with that and making sure that this learning I'm creating is as impactful as possible. There's other things you can do, like, for example, can we put some measurement in place, even if we're not asked for it, so that we know whether or not this learning or training has solved the problem? Now, if it hasn't solved the problem, then we can go back and hopefully have some additional conversation about what might be causing that issue at that time. So we can sort of reverse engineer the strategy or insert something that is unexpected to show that we can do more. We have some additional value that we can offer. So those are a couple ideas. Questions are really going to be your best friend when you're trying to gain influence, especially at a lower level. And so, TJ, I see your question in the chat. So, Casey, if you were going to go there, I see that one in the chat, which is a very similar, which it's the boss that's not asking these questions. You don't need to strategically say no to your boss. That might not be an issue, but you can start asking your boss some of these questions. Like, is this tied to a strategic initiative in the company? You're not saying, no, you're not going to do the work, but you're starting to plant some seeds, which is a way of leading up, if you will, to help your boss understand some different questions they might be asking without directly telling them to do so. What else have we got, Casey?
Beautiful. We're all caught up now. That was
All right.
amazing.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to know before we wrap up from all of you, based on everything we just covered, these two decision trees, the strategic the strategic and considerate no, the strategic and considerate no, being intentional. What's one concept that we talked about today that you're going to utilize after this to avoid the regretful yes and respond with strategic intention? What's one thing that you can do or that you will do after this webinar? Asking questions of your boss. Yeah. I have my daughter is 23 and she's in her very first corporate role. And she's very sensitive to this because she's saying, I don't want to come across as the 23-year-old know-it-all, but there's things that I think, why are we doing it this way? It doesn't make any sense. And so the advice that I'm always giving to her is you don't have to tell somebody this doesn't make sense. You can start to ask some really good questions that help others to think about it differently. And that's a way that you can gain influence without sort of coming across as a, no, I'm not going to do that, or telling you a different way, etc. So we've got leading up, sharing with your team, decision trees, shifting from a request form to a joint problem solving mission. Yeah. And it can start with a request form if that's something that works in your organization. But your request form doesn't need to be all about the learning outcomes. It can be about determining whether or not that deeper dive is needed. And then if that is needed, you can go a little bit deeper with that person to be a partner in problem solving, if you will, as opposed to simply a responder to a request. Getting access to the person who can actually answer the questions, making sure it's worth the deep dive from the very start. Awesome. I am so glad that you all have had a few key takeaways that you can take and use. I strive to, in my work, be really both empowering and practical, knowing that these things we are doing are not easy. They're tricky. They involve a lot of human elements like trust, influence, collaboration, strategy, things that get complicated because of the nature of different human personalities and that kind of thing. And so this shift, I believe, because I have done it, is one that we can do. It's just two things. A, it won't happen overnight. And B, it's going to take all of us. And it's going to take doing things in a very small way, very small and practical actions. So we can do it. It just won't happen right away. So I strive to be both empowering and practical. A few other ways you can be in touch with me. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if that's something that's helpful to you. I do have a book that was recently released. It's called L&D Order Taker No More, Become a Strategic Business Partner. It was published by ATD Press. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, ATD, wherever books are sold. That is everything that we just talked about and more within that book. It's the result of my own journey, as well as those that I talked with. I wrote it to be the handbook that I never had when I was working to make this shift. And then, of course, we do have a podcast called L&D Must Change, where I'm interviewing brilliant minds in this profession who are calling for change in big or small ways. That's me. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation today. And thanks, Casey, for having me.
Yeah, it is my pleasure. We are so excited to have you back. This is such a good session. This is one of those you're gonna want to watch it again, and you're probably gonna want to share it with a colleague. So empowering, so practical. I love that kind of summation. Thank you so much, Jess, for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you all the participants that are joining us today. Thank you all so much. And maybe we'll see some of you guys at DevLearn in Vegas next week. So we're excited for that as well. So you guys take care. We'll see you soon.